Great. Thanks everyone for joining. It's my great pleasure to introduce Sharon Quinsaat, who's going to speak on her recent book, Insurgent Communities. Highly recommend, with University of Chicago Press. Just would like to thank my colleagues at the New York Southeast Asia Network and SULO, the Philippine Studies Initiative at NYU, for co-sponsoring Sharon's talk. Sharon's gonna speak for say 30 to 40 minutes or so, and then since we're doing a Zoom meeting, we'll have the opportunity for a interactive kind of conversation with her following the presentation. So Sharon Quinsaat is a scholar of social movements and migration and an associate professor of sociology at Grinnell College. She's currently has a very severe hardship posting in her sabbatical year in Hawaii. And she's already starting on her next project, and maybe at the end we can get a little bit of a teaser from her on what her next project's going to be and why we think she should include New York in that project. So without further ado, Sharon, turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, John. Is my audio good? Yeah. Okay. Thank you for also pronouncing my last name really well. You pronounce it really well. And yeah, I'd like to thank the Sulu Philippine Studies Initiative, the Southeast Asia Network, and the Asian Pacific American Institute at New York University for organizing this book event. And I'm particularly grateful, of course, to Emily Tumale and John Gershman for inviting me and arranging everything. So I would like to start this book talk with a little bit of anecdote. So, as you know, I was doing research in the Netherlands, like for my book, and I've been doing research there since 2011, I think 2010. So when I was there doing field work, I met this Belgian national who has been living in the Netherlands for 10 years. And he said that, when he found out that I was doing research on the Filipino diaspora, basically, that's the term I use, he said that he has encountered many Belgians in Canada and the US as well, in other countries. And then he ended wondering, he said, I wonder if there is a so-called Belgian diaspora, right? That's what he kind of wondered. And back in graduate school, I was an international student from the Philippines, 2008 in UC Irvine. And I remember I went to grad school with someone from Singapore, and then she met other Singaporeans, but she said that they don't really connect well. Like she said, like, I really don't need to hang out with them. I don't connect well with them. And then she said, it's not like we're like a diaspora or something, right? So that kind of like made me think about this notion of a diaspora. And as I continued doing research on the Philippines, Filipinos in the Netherlands and the US after grad school, I began to wonder about this notion of diaspora. I'm just going to share this PowerPoint. Okay. Is this good? Yeah. So I started asking the question, when people move and settle in other countries, do they automatically form a diaspora, right? So based on the use of the term, especially the more popular term, current term, and even the scholarly literature, living the homeland is sufficient to talk about the this imagination of being part of a diaspora. But literature and my research also point to the fact that migration is only one piece of the puzzle. So the other pieces have to do with recognizing group fate and developing community. And these processes may appear very natural and automatic. After all, you think about being rooted in one culture, nation, and territory. You talk the language, and for some, of course, like language is not always that connection, but you eat the same food, etc., etc. But diasporas do not emerge simply, and I show this in the book, from this like what we call primordial attachment rooted on ancestry and connection to the land. And they arise mostly when migrants create a collective identity that springs from the shared meanings that they ascribe to and actions they take because of these so-called primordial attachments. So in other words, like we sort of think about diasporas materializing when a common discourse to make sense of migrants' personal lives are forged. Okay, I have to make, okay. So in the book, I try to show that diasporas do not emerge from migration alone, and you have to construct them. And using the case of the Filipinos in the US and the Netherlands, I showed that one way of creating this so-called diaspora is through transnational activism. And I elaborate in the book too, by no means this is the only way, but this is a powerful way of constructing diaspora. And why is this a powerful way of constructing the diaspora? Because why is this like keep on? I don't know if I'm doing something wrong. It's not moving. There you go. So I show that migrants become a diaspora when they develop collective identities based on loyalty to homeland, ethnic or national solidarity, and shared history in times of political and social conflict. I highlight the role of political and social conflicts here because this is very important. This is when cleavages in the social order become visible and those primordial attachments are no longer, sufficient for you to have those connections with people who are like you, are Filipinos or who eat the same food, etc. In times of conflicts, especially those that involve the state and other institutions that sort of like structure our daily routines, our daily lives, we start to question and reflect on our beliefs, loyalties, and values, elements that make up our identities, right? And so you start asking, well, who do I support? Why do I feel this way? Right? What does it say about me if I'm supporting the rebels instead of the state, for example? So we are often forced to think in us versus them terms and then take sides. And so since migrants are not homogenous, the communities, whether this is hometown association or other sort of like, small groups that we are embedded in, they become arenas for deliberation and negotiation. And when we do these like deliberation and negotiation, we are trying also to make sense of, questions about, again, loyalty and continued belonging to the homeland, solidarity with co-ethnics, and the shared history. So in these dialogues and among migrants, and also, of course, like public performances to targets, a so-called diaspora is formed. Okay, so diaspora, basically, in my book, I show that it's very much intertwined with social movement processes. Okay, because I show that social with it in terms of conflict, the homeland and countries of settlement, for example, expose fissures and paradoxes in the roots of our identity. And there emerge often conflict even within particular social units like the family, the community, etc. Right? And when these conflicts emerge, sometimes you turn to groups that are more likely to perhaps thrive in times of conflict, right? And this is often what we call like social movements. So social movement among migrants emerge from these conflicts, especially if the issues directly or indirectly affect them, materially or symbolically, and if the state is a primary source of people's grievances and target. Okay. And through social movements, we disrupt, question, and transform the narratives, practices, rituals, and symbols that that we pull from the so-called like culture as a toolkit to make sense of our identities, whether it's an ethnic or national identity or other identities. Okay, so in my book, I elaborate this empirical basis of my argument are three overlapping and transnational social movements. So first is the movement against the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos. So I was I was already a child in the Philippines. I grew up there when Marcos was in power, was overthrown. So I had memories of it too. And then the movement for migrant rights, and then the movement to reconstruct collective memory of the authoritarian period. So why these three movements? Well, these movements tackled issues that created conflicts within the Filipino communities, and therefore drove the formation and negotiation of collective identities through debate and dialogue. So this book, my book, reveals the elements that work together to form a diaspora. So elements that migrants and succeeding generation confront, challenge, and reconstitute in times of conflict, which is the three elements that you'll find in all literature about diaspora. Well, first is loyalty, the other one is solidarity, and the last one is, of course, history. So those are like what I want to elaborate on in terms of the construction of the Filipino diaspora. So I looked at three social movements, as I mentioned before. So you have the anti-dictatorship movement, and you could see there what is it I'm tackling there when I kind of show. Although, like I said, like it's not that okay, the anti-dictatorship only focus on loyalty to the homeland and ethnic and national solidarity and shared history for the other one. They were very much overlapping. It's just that the main sort of like collective identity, basis of collective identity that they focus on were these three. So the anti-dictatorship as a venue for the negotiation of loyalty to the homeland, migrants' rights for ethnic and national solidarity, and the collective memory activism on shared history. I also looked at, Filipino communities in two countries. So understanding the formation of diaspora necessitates looking at the actions and identities of migrants in more than one country. Okay. Because, Africana studies scholar Kim Butler argues that the term diaspora implies dispersal, not a mere transfer from the homeland to a single place, to a single country, right? And we need to make sure that we're also accounting for the heterogeneity of migrant groups. So in various countries, for example, in the so-called like new destinations among Filipinos, after the labor export policy of Marcos, they are more likely to not able to settle, right? Not able to settle because there's no citizenship, they're contract based, right? They're also unable to, of course, like build like community there intergenerationally, because if they ever like have children there, they will have to send back to the Philippines because they're unable to care for them, because of course their contract says like, you can't bring family here, etc., etc. So the multi-generational reproduction may not be, as that we see in diaspora, may not be there. At the same time, we in sociology, we also want to make sure that, especially if my focus is in social movements, I want to make sure that I am able to observe like contentious forms of politics, because that's the basis of my theorizing, right? So I looked at the Filipinos in the Netherlands. Because while, for example, Filipinos in the Middle East or like in Asia may be larger and, an opportunity for me to study because it's a new destination after the labor export policy. Well, Netherlands is also the case because protest is not permitted there and organizing is not permitted. It's hard for me to be able to observe forms of activism there. Both countries too, the Netherlands and the United States, are what we call like liberal democratic countries. So there is that element of like control that I could do in terms of being able to see this formation of diaspora through protests. Similarities, but also there are differences. As you can see there, a small, diffuse, and largely new, right? Because the country became only a destination for Filipinos in the mid 1960s. So I'm just going to go over just very quickly because it's important again to for us to be able to see like the basis of all of this theorizing. So I'm drawing from the constructivist approach to diaspora formation, where they highlight that our diaspora, sorry, are not pre-political objects in a natural state of existence, and point to the role of discourses, elite actors, and strategic mobilization in their construction. So it's very important here that, those who mobilize are able to capture, and articulate, amplify discourses that make sense to migrants, but also encourage the recognition of commonality leading to collective action. When we're talking about diasporas too, we want to make sure that it's dynamic and not static, right? So there's a processual approach. So there are these identities, these discourses that become the basis for these identities are continuously renegotiated. Because of course, there's all continuous flow of migrants. There's also again, new generation of migrants being born. So we want to make sure that we are able to see how migrants themselves are involved in boundary maintenance as varied groups compete for dominance in defining, the parameters of belonging. So essentially, a constructivist and processual approach shows that we need to analyze diaspora by treating it as a dependent or an outcome variable, as you would say it. We are not going to assume that migrants eventuate and become a diaspora. We need actually to explain that formation. Okay, rather than making already this notion of they're already a diaspora, that's why they're mobilizing politically as a starting point. So it also goes with, and I engage with this in my book, the work of Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy, which is more in the cultural studies field, but Stuart Hall is also a social scientist, looking at the dynamic aspect and continuous formation of diaspora. So again, the question is, though, when, why, and how collective identities arise among a diverse group of migrants, and what discourses inform their identities? If we're going to look at it processually and in constructivist way. So I did mention that it is best observed during times of conflict, and social movements emerge as a key in collective identity formation. And social movements are so important because, during times of large-scale mobilization, as I said, activists nurture affective bonds and commitment to certain beliefs, as well as sustain oppositional culture. It's not just, when you look at like the photos here of the anti-dictatorship struggle, which I am now going to talk about, we see this collective identity formation not only like during protests, but like, for example, when they make claims in public, demonstrations, as you can see here, but what we call like also like everyday politics, or now we call it prefigurative politics. The day-to-day work and the continuous like creation of the society that we want to create is also an opportunity for us to build those identities and in turn build that diaspora. So like I said, I look at the three social movements, and I'm going to focus on the anti-dictatorship movement and how they nurtured loyalty to the homeland. Okay. So I will show the development of my book argument through this movement, and I will show the elements that I said about construction of collective identities, a process oriented aspect of diaspora formation, and what does it mean when we talk about collective identity. Okay. So the thing about any kind of movement, and I'm pretty sure you are observing it right now, right, with what is going on in Israel and Palestine, allegiance, like anything that counters or go against the homeland state, it's hard for people to think about, are you loyal still to the homeland, right? Because there's this continuous association between the homeland and the state equals people, right? So my question was really, if allegiance to the homeland constitutes a core foundation in the creation of diasporas, how does protesting its government convey migrants' desire for belonging, especially if they are outside its physical boundaries, right? It's hard enough that you are not within the territorial boundaries of the nation state, but to even protest like the state that sort of like represents, because of course it dominates people's imagination of loyalty, it makes it harder. So how can activists portray their struggle from afar to depose a native home regime as a patriotic mission, especially if they are detached from the day-to-day suffering of the people, right? So here I demonstrate that what the anti-dictatorship movement did in both the Netherlands and the US is they challenged the state as a natural reference point for the development of migrants' homeland-oriented collective identities. When they challenged that the state, as represented by the Marcos regime, is not the Philippines, is not the Filipino people, right? They opened the arena for different imaginations of national membership to flourish. And so one that disentangles the government from the nation or from the people, right? The people is not the government. I'm pretty sure you've heard that so many times. They talk about that too, about Americans, of course, and right now with the conflict, as I said, like some are distinguishing, the Jewish people with the Israeli state, right? So loyalty to the homeland is loyalty to the people, is what they're saying, right? In the movement. Okay. So here, just a brief background, and again, as I said, because it's also Filipino-American National History Month, the anti-dictatorship movement, I'm sure some of you are very familiar already, just trying to give a brief background here. It was very active in the United States, of course, and other parts of the world. And here, like they really built a movement constituency. So it's not just a bunch of or a few activists, right, protesting. They went to actual organizations like hometown associations, church groups, et cetera, so that they can be part of the movement. So it is a movement constituency. Okay, someone who goes to church every day to hear the mass is also part of that movement. So they built that movement. And then they also, what we call like decertify the Marcos administration as no longer representative of the Filipino people. And also, it's a simultaneous process. They certify contenders to his authority, and there were three in the Philippines, the communists, the more separatists, and the elite opposition, as the true representatives of the Filipino people. So how did they do this? So for the people in the United States, for the activists in the United States, they did this through foreign policy lobbying in the US. And then for those in the Netherlands, it was the naming and shaming in the Public Opinion Tribunal. So I'm going to focus on, of course, like all of these, like, again, as I said, because we don't have a lot of time, I'm just going to focus on the building a movement constituency. And I'm going to focus also on naming and shaming in Public Opinion Tribunal, which is probably less known, especially here in the United States. So in terms of building a movement constituency, some of you have probably heard of these organizations, right? These were the four main organizations. Of course, there are others, but these are the ones that sort of like became almost synonymous to the anti-dictatorship movement here in the US. You had four of them, okay? Despite ideological differences, they joined forces to denounce the regime and pressure the US government to withdraw support for Marcos. For example, like they've had various historic unity meetings. They came out with various statements. And Renato from NCRCLP, again, I'm demonstrating like, how do you build a constituency, right? So that it's not just a bunch of activists like doing protests, but people who are going to work every day, mothers, et cetera, et cetera. So Renato here, who's an activist, said, I think it was important to try to unite the broadest cross-section of the Filipino community against the dictatorship. We recognized that we needed to have a broader approach to build consensus in the Filipino community to oppose dictatorship, and that was to have it pitched to civil liberties. So they highlighted here how it was very important to have the broadest cross-section, the broadest call, and calling that time, because they were also associated with the Communist Party of the Philippines in the National Democratic Front, calling for, let's say, a revolutionary struggle, for example, and a communist movement to lead this revolutionary movement would be alienating. Okay, so they pitched it, NCRCLP, to the civil liberties frame. Okay. And then, as I said, they did a lot of historic unity meetings. So here you can see this was, I think, this is the Filipino Counter Forum. It was in Washington, D.C., but they also did numerous events in New York. That historic meeting was actually in New York, December 30, 1973, when all organizations, regardless of political persuasion, came together. Because before they had ideological differences. Think about, Raul Manglapus, who is like from the oligarchic elite in the Philippines and who is mostly concerned about, how those who are elite that were not part of the Marcos regime are now living in exile, right? And they want to have a stake also in the Philippines. And then there's the others who are struggling for communism, right? How do you make those two together? So you can see here the framing that I told you about decertifying Marcos as no longer a representative of the Filipino people, thereby supporting the state is not really supporting the Filipino people. So they talk about here Marcos fulfilling his contract with the Filipino people and stepped down from office. He does not represent the Filipino people. And there's also, we stand together with the Filipino people in the homeland. So there is that cross-border construction there of what it means to be Filipino. Okay, so this was, of course, very, very problematic also because there were a lot of Filipinos in the United States who were not really concerned about the political developments in the Philippines and who chose to keep their distance. There were also those who, of course, were conservative. And there were those who are very much active in the community, activists in the community, but they think that Philippine concerns are a distraction to what they're fighting for as minorities in the United States. Okay. Eileen here was a community leader and an organizer, and she thought that participating in the anti-dictatorship movement would drain resources from and efforts to address the problems of Filipino immigrants in the U.S. You can see her reflection below. Here captures the ambiguities of transnational belonging among U.S.-born Filipinos. Eileen is a second-generation Filipino. She makes here a firm distinction between issues there in the Philippines and about Marcos, you can see there, and here in the US and about the death of Americans, some of them Filipino, in the Vietnam War, while also asserting her Filipino identity. And I'm very Filipino. I am probably more Filipino than a lot of them, right? Those who are struggling to support the anti-dictatorship movement. So this was common among the Filipinos that I interviewed, and also some of the, because I didn't talk about my methodology, but I had diaries and some documents that they shared with me. Okay. And so to counter people who are like Eileen, KDP came out with this statement through Ang Katipunan, was an organ of that time of the organization. It came out with this editorial entitled "Stand Up for the Stand Up for the Homeland." And it called attention to the privilege of Filipinos in the US relative to those in the Philippines under the dictatorship, despite their marginalization. Again, you highlight there, like what I called, like, it's not just loyalty that it focused on, but also solidarity. So here, brothers and sisters who remain back home. Okay. One of the main campaigns of that unity, like I said, group, the movement, is that appealed to Filipinos in the US was the fight against the payment of income taxes by Filipino citizens overseas. So you can see here again the sort of like, kind of making sure that we distinguish between the Philippine state or Marcos regime and the people, because it says to pay your taxes is to support the Marcos dictatorship, right? It's use dollars to kill our Muslim brothers, maintain political prisons, etc. But it also calls attention to, the unity of Filipinos. So again, that process of framing it as we are against the state, but we are united as people. Okay. So what does this mean? So there are processes here that are very important to highlight. Okay. Here you have opposition to the policy, divorcing support from the state from the love of the nation. And there's also what we call a migrant agency frame. Actions of large number of Filipinos overseas can influence political outcomes in the homeland. Now, what about what was happening in Europe? Okay, so in Europe, like I said, what they were doing, and the Netherlands was very central, okay, in this campaign, because it was where the Communist Party of the Philippines National Democratic Front were had a base because they were exiled there. It was very important to see, and I can talk more about that. Why were they there? So a lot of it has to do with the relationship between Filipinos and Dutch missionaries and volunteers there. There was also the establishment of solidarity groups in Europe and the asylum of members of CPP-NDF that led to this creation of a community and a movement against the dictatorship. And what they did is to make sure that they held Marcos accountable in the international community. They can't do foreign policy lobbying because the Netherlands and even Western Europe isn't really giving a lot of money to Marcos. It was the US, which is the focus of the movement there. So what can they do? What they can do is make sure that he's held accountable in the realm of what we call like international public opinion, right? So there's establishment of different solidarity groups in the Netherlands. So they connected various, of course, various policies, various issues that Filipinos were facing in the Dutch people. So it's in the through the FGN, Filipino Group Netherlands, that kind of like made sure that this is an issue in the Dutch public, right? Because there's not really strong ties between the Netherlands and the Philippines. And so when we're talking about how do you make sure that they know what is it happening in the Philippines, and like an archipelago that is so detached to their imagination, only because, they only know in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, because of colonial migrants, of course. And then also in terms of dictatorship, everyone was focused back then on what is happening in Latin America, and Latin American exiles were in Europe as well. So they had a stronger like so-called voice. So the asylum of members of the CPP was very important. It created a social movement community in Utrecht. That's where I also conducted my ethnography, and I did live in Utrecht as well. The top leadership being in the Netherlands was very important because, again, if we are thinking about strategic mobilization and discourses, it's very important to have those activists that are interpreting the grievances of Filipinos there, and also making sure that it's anchored on this larger discourse about the revolution and also a transnational community. Okay. The thing with the NDF and CPP-NDF is that in their files, I saw that in the beginning, they said that overseas Filipinos, both settled and migrant, are generally considered as potential internal forces of the Philippine Revolution if they belong to one of the national democratic classes, and if national identification with the Philippines is still principal to them. Now, this is so important because, many Filipinos are regionalistic, right? Their identification is through their hometowns, through their regions, through their provinces. And back then, they weren't really as concerned with, again, the national democratic movement. So they had to adjust a little bit about, they had to interpret it. So how do we do this so that we make sure that we're also capturing their other forms of identification? And I show in the migrants' rights chapter how they identify more actually with their class. Okay, it's more of their class as OFW in the 80s and 90s, but back then it was mostly regionalism or provincialism. So there was naming and shaming in Europe. So this is the photo that was in my book too. This is Luis Alandoni. He was a top leader of the Communist Party National Democratic Front. So in the Permanent People's Tribunal, what they did was create a transnational activist network, which consisted of diaspora and solidarity groups. And what they did is what we call in international relations naming and shaming. So a tactic that you publicize human rights violations and employ pressure as perpetrators of their actions gain attention. Okay. So one of the things that they also did is that in naming and shaming, they made sure that Marcos is also responsible for what is going on with the Filipinos in Europe, because there were already OFW then, because of his labor export policy, their marginalization and exploitation. So making those connections. So you're not really doing all the suffering. You're not only the cause of the suffering of Filipinos in the Philippines, but also of the Filipinos here in Europe and abroad. Okay. So as you can see there, this is a testimony by an overseas Filipino worker. It says that Marcos's political and economic policies, which forced thousands of Filipinos to go abroad to find jobs due to unemployment at home. Okay. So again, it was able to bridge that macro structures in the homeland and micro level processes in the host society. And there's a shared experience among Filipinos of migration, separation, and exploitation, which are all products of the Marcos regime. So in that sense, through the Public Opinion Tribunal, we were able again to separate the state from the nation and had a different imagination of loyalty to the homeland. Okay. So the verdict, it was deprived of legitimate standing as a government in international society and lacks the competence to act on behalf of the Filipino or the Bangsamoro people. Okay. So the anti-dictatorship movement had three outcomes. First is denaturalize the relationship between the state and the nation. It contested the idea that resistance to the state is an act of disloyalty to the nation, and it opened up opportunities to imagine loyalty and belonging to the homeland beyond the state. So again, just to recap the argument of the book, diasporas do not emerge from migration alone. They must be created, and one way of doing it is through activism. And I showed in the various chapters that migrants become a diaspora when they develop collective identities based on loyalty to the homeland, ethnic or national solidarity, and shared history in times of political and social conflict. Thank you very much.
Great, and thank you so much, Sharon. That was really, you were able to distill an incredible amount from the book, which of course people should still go out and get the book, because there's even much more there, and you were able to give kind of a real top line view, but the richness of the book really offers readers so much more. Now, I'm sure there's some folks looking at the attendance list, some people who have some questions and so forth. So why don't we, people can, now we're all used to this, just raise your virtual hands and I'll call on you as kind of the traffic cop of the discussion. Wesley Judd.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Sharon, for sharing your research with us. I have not read your book yet, but I look forward to reading it. Your book your book says that diasporas emerge through political activism and that social movements provide an essential space for addressing migrants' diverse experiences and relationships with their homeland and its history. Uh, my question is, or rather, my concern is, I'm curious to what extent this Filipino diaspora has been successful in shaping Filipino American attitudes towards populism in the Philippines. Because Marcos, as you all know, is a strong man, he's a populist leader,
Mm-hmm.
and his regime is a focal point of activism, which continues
Mm-hmm.
even today, given how
Mm-hmm.
his son won the presidential elections back in 2022. And
Right,
of course, the son of the dictator won the overseas vote in America.
right, right,
So, how do we make sense of this,
right.
particularly from the lens of your research?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, thank you so much for that question. And that's something that I wrote in the preface and also towards the end. Because now, like, you're talking about, of course, like populism, like during the time of Marcos, although it was, already developing theoretically that concept of populism. It's now that it's just being like really deployed analytically, right? So I'm gonna speak with right now what is going on in terms of organizing and the ways in which how is this book like diaspora being
Mm,
constructed to political mobilization relevant,
mm.
right? I'm glad that you highlighted that he won. It's only in the Vatican, and I think was it
Australia.
Australia,
Yeah, yeah,
where Robredo, the opponent,
yes,
lost.
one.
So
Yeah.
won. Like I was in the Netherlands, and then I was in Germany also when he was declared because I was giving a talk, and they were shocked that across overseas Filipinos, especially those in liberal democratic states, right?
Mm,
Like he won. So how did that happen? Right. So a lot of it, and of course, like there are so many explanations about it, and you could read all about the role of the failure of the liberal democracy in the Philippines. There's a lot on disinformation. But I had the opportunity also to witness debates within the community because I was observing, for example, in the Netherlands, I was living in Amsterdam, the Robredo camp, the Kakampinks, like in Amsterdam, I think that was the group, and then the BBM Netherlands, right?
mm,
And it is indeed, there's a lot of disinformation happening. So there was a woman, she was undocumented, and she wanted to earn more money, and she asked, can I clean your house? I was renting an apartment. It was so strange for me because like, I was a researcher, but she said like, I need an extra money, we're going home. So but it was an opportunity to learn about the dynamics because she was very hardcore Bongbong Marcos, right? And every time she would show me all of these so-called media influencers or political analysts that she followed, and I think they
mm,
also targeted her in terms of getting all of that in like her algorithms, but she was showing me all of this. How, and the framing is not so much with like even Philippine politics, but Bongbong as very, very good for OFWs so
mm,
that finally they can go home, right? And I was like shocked at this. My mom's an OFW in Italy. She's still there. So the fact that they're making that connection about Bongbong Marcos will be the key so that you can finally go home and be reunited with your family there. It's very powerful, right? So how do we make sense of all of this, especially in terms of what I just found
mm,
out? And you can also look at the ways in which also Filipinos here in the US, some of them are also supportive of the Trump presidency, or not just Trump presidency, but conservatism in general, which is the focus of my project right now. So when elections and social media is now central for the invention of diasporas, as we've seen not only in the case of the Philippines in 2016, but also like in Turkey, for example, the Turkish diaspora mobilizing in support of Erdogan, Romania as well, Hungary. What then is the value of studying diaspora construction through protests? So I demonstrate in the book this so-called conflict mobilization collective identity nexus that has implications for contemporary empirical research. I show in the book that social conflict in the homeland or the countries of destination provides an opportunity for individuals to question their normally taken for granted identities. So we don't really think about being Filipino every day, right? We think about more of like our identity as mothers, as friends, even, as daughters. But these identities, in situations where migrants are forced to take sides, such as, for instance, Duterte's war on drugs, they become salient and politicized, okay? So conflict is thus central to diaspora construction as it exposes the fragility of again, being a Filipino, the primordial boundaries, when social cleavages are sort of like cloaked in our desire to be loyal to the homeland and to be united. So contradictions of belonging allow us to think about like who we are. And it allows social movements, or in the case of the recent elections, like Philippines, micro-influencers and social media to instigate or intervene in collective identity formation. So what we're saying is like conflict, as opposed to what people think, is actually good because it helps us think about who we are as people, right? So right now, there's a lot of conflict. Like here in Honolulu, there's that anniversary, of course, of the martial law, and there's that Bong Bong BBM group still alive, and the Kakamping still alive. And they always talk about that. What is that? What it's not so much who is a Filipino, the question, but what does it mean to be a Filipino now that we have elected, right? Someone who is the son of the dictator. So that is what I'm trying to show. The continuous like questioning of what it means to be loyal, what it means to be in solidarity, what it means to have a history where now it is, of course, like we know, like there's a lot of historical revision right now. So I hope that the book like contributes to that.
Thank you.
And floor is open if other folks have questions. And I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to ask you a question then, which is, so you of course for the presentation you didn't go as much into the historical origins of kind of labor export as a strategy and the kind of the key role that the state played both in the colonial period and the post-colonial period. I'm wondering if you could talk about then how you focused on in your 3 case studies these particular kind of moments and processes of diaspora construction. And at the same time, you acknowledged that there were other competing currents of diasporas kind of existing contemporaneously with these. So I'm trying to understand how do you see that? Do you see these as distinctive diasporas? For example, in the context of the pro-Duterte versus, and then the kind of pro-Bongbong currents versus the other currents, are these distinct diasporas? Are they different currents within one kind of overall diaspora? How do you conceptualize the nature of this, since in part there's certainly some shared elements of identity, but others are, as you talk about the boundary making processes, that people are defined against those other currents simultaneously. So
Right.
how do you think about that?
Right. That is so interesting. And one thing that you highlighted there is like, if this is part of the whole process, right, John, of like diaspora formation, it's just like different actors, different, or is it part of the, again, the conflict part of diaspora formation? Because we tend to think about diaspora as just unity, but if there's conflict, then there's various actors involved in conflict, right? And I did highlight in my book the role and the powerful role of the state in the construction of diaspora. In fact, it was, of course, the one that has dominated the imagination of what it is to be in this like Filipino diaspora or part of the overseas community, right? So the state is very much engaged in diaspora formation, and it has a lot of stake in diaspora formation. So in terms of an actor, it makes it, it really works hard to dominate that discursive construction aspect of it, right? So that the discourses that is coming more from below, okay, coming more from various actors, because if we map it, there are various actors, right? There could even be various actors like celebrities or like, you know, like for example, like when we're rallying to root for Manny Pacquiao or the Olympics, right? And we're all like, damn, like I have my jersey with, you know, Carlos Yulo or something like that. There is that venue also, sports as an arena for diaspora construction, right? And then you have someone like probably activists saying that, oh, you know, like Carlos Yulo was not really supported by the state, you know, he's from the working class. That's contesting that, you know, more celebratory, you know, critical view of the role of the states in the venue of sports, right? So state is very powerful because, as I mentioned before, the labor export policy, which was also by John, essentially the state created like what they call like a new diaspora, because before Filipinos were just going to the US, right? And now they're dispersed everywhere, right? Because of labor export policy. We want to make sure the state is very crucial in this, that they remain loyal to us. Because what's going to happen if they start becoming loyal to other states, right? That, like, for example, in their countries of residence, if they're able to do that. So among with the state, starting with Marcos, there were three processes that three programs that it did, and this is again countering what the activists did, is also to counter the discourses coming from those policies, right? The homeland tourism, I'm pretty sure you know, Balikbayan program, of course, like Adrian has a book on that. Homecoming is very important. What does it mean for us to go home finally, right? So Balikbayan program was a major program by the state saying that you should come here, you should see what it is that we have. But some of the Balikbayan are also countering narratives, right, of the state, like nothing has changed, for example, more of the same, right? So they are actors themselves too. The other one is the discourse, of course, on the Bagong Bayani, the new heroes, the OFWs, right? So again, it's a state construction, but there are, again, if we look at it as part of the diaspora process of diaspora formation, so many are also countering it, right? Or validating it, right? The Bagong Bayani one. And the other one is, of course, the ways in which the state actually extended membership to everyone who are overseas through citizenship, right? Now we are recognizing you as a Filipino citizen, even if I'm not sure about the dual citizen in the US anymore. Can someone who is like a third generation Filipino apply for dual citizenship? Like ancestry, I forgot. If your great grandparents or great grandparents, they have that in like European countries, right? But see how like ancestry become like part of now being a member of the nation. But before the Marcos regime, because of the dictatorship, if you've seen like his transcript, he was actually calling the Filipinos in the US, especially those protesting, as traitors to the nation. You left because you want a good life, you know. They were calling them state commandos, you know. I'm sure you've read about that, how like you're there protesting my regime, but you're eating your steak, you live a comfortable life, you know. Like he had all of those, but now the regime is actually embracing it, embracing the OFWs, embracing the Filipinos here in the US, because it also needed their support, the state needs their support in order to flourish. So as like going back, I know it's a long-winded answer, but John's question, it's like this process of diaspora formation, multiple actors, right? And then also multiple venues. And sometimes there's validation of state discourses, but there's also countering of state discourses, and also like making like discourses based on perhaps alternative forms of belonging, whether it is maybe more belonging to a class-based formation, for instance, which a lot of Filipino Americans did, part of the, they were celebrating the KDP, were part of the international working class, et cetera, or other forms of belonging too.
Well, if I can ask a follow-up on the role of the state, did you see anything in the trajectory with the expansion of overseas voting rights to Filipinos, right, in the early 2000s? Did that, because previously the kind of that more direct political participation role did not exist.
Yeah.
Like, so during the Marcos period and so forth. Do you see
Right.
that as, and this has become a broader political question amongst other countries, right? About do they enfranchise their diasporas, and if so, how,
Right.
so on and so forth. Do you see that as playing a distinctive role, having a distinctive impact in the process once that
Yeah.
overseas Filipinos could actually vote?
Right. I saw like how it's now very crucial in, if we're looking at diaspora formation as a process, diaspora formation. If I can vote, I have a say in what is happening in the Philippines, right? It's what I'm getting, and there actually they mobilize it, and perhaps like it even replace like activism. Now that they can vote, that is their way of asserting their belonging politically, right? So economically, they are, of course, a major actor, right? But politically, are they an actor? And they said, of course, they've always been an actor, like from the exiles into Spain to, but now it's more of that electoral politics that has dominated. So there's a lot of mobilization to register them. For example, here I saw it for in the next election, making sure that they're aware what does it mean to vote for a party list or whatever. So all of these mobilization towards election also, because elections are not as how would you call it, radical, right? It validates the role of the elite too, right? In that sense, versus, for example, when you are mobilizing more to contest like power of various elites like Marcos, or against elites like there's so much mobilization. It was, of course, the heyday in US and even in the Netherlands in the 70s and 80s. Really even like mobilizing against like investments from like World Bank, from World Bank, or investments from major companies like Shell or whatever. So that's so interesting to me that is, I see that less and less, of course, with like young generation. Of course, there's a lot with, now you have anak bayan and all of these formations, but that is if we look at it like in terms of scale, the mobilization for elections have perhaps been much more now than before.
Great. Adrian.
Yeah, can you hear me all right? There's just a lot of
Yeah.
noise in the background. Great. Good to see you, Sharon. It's been a while.
Good to see you. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually want to pick up on a point that you brought up earlier about Marcos Senior's administration, and the ways that they framed, overseas communities as, the insurgents, et cetera. And there's a kind of like, the way that you historicize it, right, is that there's a kind of embrace of diaspora. I would actually argue that, and I want to hear how you think about this. I would actually argue that at the same time as the Marcos, as Ferdinand and Imelda were trying to denigrate the diaspora, they were also trying to attract a certain kind of diaspora and a certain kind of affiliation, right? This is the Like Buying program. This is like, tourism initiatives, right? And we see that with like, Vanessa Hudgens right now being the global tourism ambassador, but that obviously like has a much longer history, right? I want to hear you talk about communism, actually, like as a specific ideology, but as a specific movement that, with the rise of the contemporary Philippine nation state has always subverted the legitimacy of the state itself, right? And part of Marcos's denigration of the overseas Filipinos was both, a lot of them were part of the communist movements that were always, threatening, political stability at home, but also abroad, right? Where do you see that now? Like, I really
Right,
appreciate,
right.
I really appreciate the point that was brought up about like the enfranchisement of overseas Filipinos. In some ways, I would read that as counterinsurgency, right? It's kind of like
Right,
diasporic
yeah.
counterinsurgency, right? Where do you see communist organizing right
Yeah.
now? Does it still play a part? Does it shape a lot of this overseas political, diasporic formation? What's the state's response,
Yeah, yeah,
et cetera?
yeah. Yeah, that is so interesting because, well, you know that I think most of us know that Jose Maria Sison, who is the founder of CPP, like passed away, right? And they said, who would replace him? In terms, they say, of the influence of the CPP NDF in Philippine politics, it's actually waning, right? It's waning because first they said there's no continuity. When you have a communist movement that needs to put forward an alternative vision of society, Philippine society, you need also people who would accept this vision. The vision that they have for now and the interpretation is still like, semi-feudal, bureaucratic capitalism, right? There's the interpretation of the Philippines right now, the economic. They said that that's actually not the case anymore, right? So the interpretation of drama and everything, and maybe John can also say about this, that is still what's being basically maybe social, that's what like generations like, anak bayan or are socialized into when it doesn't reflect the reality in the Philippines anymore. So especially with like drama's passing and many of them like Tito Connie Ledesma and Tito Louie Halandoni, like he's very sick also. They say that he might pass away soon, etc. There's no more that sort of like intellectual like roots, who's gonna interpret it, right? What's going on there. There's a lot of organizing, but we need to put forward a vision. That's one. The other one is that they say, well, they also made a mistake, and I think Joseph Scalise and other scholars have also mentioned this before. I've analyzed it. They made a pact with Duterte in the beginning. There's a lot of information about this. They supported Duterte. So they said that alone made a lot of people question about the direction of the revolution, if they're willing to make compromises or ally with Duterte. Again, this is, I'm just like echoing what others, because I haven't examined. And another also that I have noticed, and this is my own observation, they're less able to influence the OFWs anymore in terms of thinking about their own exploitation and marginalization. The language, like for example, in their initial documents, is like sub-proletarianization and all of that. To them, if you talk to ordinary OFWs, they are making alliances, for example, with other working class, so international working class, rather than support for the Philippine National Democratic Movement, because they're still very much centered on Philippine National Democratic Movement. But the people I've interviewed, the undocumented in Amsterdam, or like my mother, for example, she was undocumented in Italy. They were talking more of a international working class struggle, and they felt more confident like allying with Dutch Moroccans, or who are struggling for this kind of internationalism rather than a Philippine oriented kind of revolution. So it's more working class solidarity in that sense. So I think that those are the kind of like the hurdles, if it continues, to put forward like a vision of society. They were thinking of the Philippines only one part of their struggle. They also need to struggle for, let's say, anti-imperialism, working class solidarity, that Philippines is just part of it, but not the soul of their loyalty, of their actions. So that is so interesting to me. Because another thing, this is just an anecdote, but when I was there, for instance, the class divisions in Amsterdam, in Netherlands, the class divisions in the community, the migrant community, was something I wasn't prepared for. I knew, like, here in the US, there's a lot of class divisions, but it's huge also, right? But such a small community, there's so much, like, the only time they interact along class lines is through these events, Independence Day, like cultural events. But they're all, like, there's a lot of Filipinos working for the UN or international NGOs. They call themselves expats, right? A very, very distinct middle class elite sort of framing of their background as immigrants. And then there are the undocumented, the housekeepers, au pairs, and then the seafarers. Seafarers are itinerant. They go from, they only dock in Rotterdam, they stay there for 2 months, and then they leave again, right? And then the second generation. What was interesting to me was the children of the CPP NDF top leadership. I interviewed them. They're not even engaged in activism, like on Philippine concerns. So it was so interesting to me. They have a very distinct European identity. So their involvement is on European affairs, although, of course, they still have this very, very strong Filipino identity. So, so again, like to go back to, the internationalism was more of that. I think that is something that they haven't, like the CPP and NDF, and this is just my opinion, maybe have to, like, grapple with.
Adrian, did you have a follow-up there? I couldn't tell if you.
I do. I mean, I have a million, but because like I'll just I guess, like, I'll end on this follow-up. Like, what's interesting to me about hearing you, kind of imminently study this transnational Filipino, like, political identity from a diaspora that, like, like, I study, like, Filipino Americans, right? And
Right.
Filipino migrants, or which has a certain, I think, both a certain tradition, but also a certain status, right? And so,
Right.
one of the things that's interesting is, like, I think you're actually advancing a sort of praxis and a sort of political vision that I think, like, a lot of, like, the sort of nationalist left can really learn from, because I think one of the critiques that for me emerges, like, seeing what happened during Duterte was, maybe the Philippine national left needs to go back to its, like, almost Bandungian roots, right? It's internationalist roots, number one, but number two, right? Like, I think there does need to, and I think this is something that can begin from the diaspora, number one, but number two, from the indigenous movements in the Philippines. There needs to be a real robust critique of the Philippine state, right? Like, I really like the way that you trace the way that the diaspora comes to disaggregate the nation and the state. And that's kind of it, right? Like, that there's, one of the mainstream visions of, like, the Philippine left has been around, like, creating a communist state, creating a socialist state, redistributing wealth, etc., right? But then what, right? Like, how do you achieve that form of statehood, or is that even viable in the context of a particular neoliberal globalization, right? In which Filipinos play a particularly unique role as the global precariat, right? And so I think, just to kind of like hammer it home from what you were saying, I think the political vision that I'm hearing you implicitly recommend to a lot of the Philippine left is right, is one that I think calls to question a lot of these orthodoxies that I think, even myself, like, I've inherited, right, in terms of
Right.
trying to
It's the
understand
same,
these things. Right.
Yeah, it's the same with me. Like, also when I'm like, oh, okay, so this doesn't make sense, or even like just to, I know we're towards the end, like my study right now. So I'm looking at Filipino conservatives, like in the US, immigrant conservatives, and Adrian, of course, like you did that wonderful, like, piece. Especially those who are very, very much hardcore when it comes to the conservative views and support for Republican and Trump supporters. And I chose Honolulu because it's historically a democratic state. How do you become even like a Republican or a conservative here when all of your ancestors or the Sakatas, and they were unionized, right? And so there's a lot of like complexities that I'm seeing. First of all, they're all over the place when it comes to their politics. They would be like pro something like tax, not taxing the rich, but they're also like, like, I'm or anti-trans, so it's really hard to map it. And I think the internationalist part, as Adrian was saying, was very important because some are, of course, like pro-Trump because they were also pro-Marcos, they're also pro-Duterte, right? In fact, like there's almost like that connection. That was how they were socialized. We need a strong man, we like it when we go after the homeless people, right? Like the policing, or more in like iron hand when it comes to all of those problems. But there are also those who are like, I am just like blown away why very liberal when it comes to US politics, right? Minority rights, labor rights. But when it comes to Philippine politics, they're very strong, like strong man, like the iron hand or the iron fist. And I'm like, how do you do that? You just talk about being a minority Filipino here and you want all of these rights, and then you say, no, actually it's okay that we incarcerate all of these like shabu users. I don't care. Just put them all in jail. I don't. It's just like I still haven't like thought about this, but yeah, those are the things that I think internationally, perhaps like their position, class position, how they view Philippines geopolitically and everything would be important there. But I just met like some of these Filipinos who are hardcore Democrat, talking about LGBTQ rights, but they said that it's okay that, yeah, Duterte did what he did, clean the streets. So, it's just like, yeah, I was a little shocked when I heard that. Yeah, but maybe not. Maybe I should not be shocked.
Well, Sharon, thanks so much. We've come to the end of time. I want to thank my colleague Dale McLaughlin, who highlighted that SULO is at the tail end of its fundraising for its 5th anniversary year. And so the link is in the chat for people who would like to contribute to supporting Philippine studies at NYU. Just on your last comment there, Sharon, I think there would be some fascinating kind of comparative work looking at the Salvadoran diaspora in the US and their support for mano duro policies or lack thereof in El Salvador, with the kind of support for disciplina or
Oh yeah,
mano duro policies in the Philippines. I think it would be an interesting there's some
I
interesting.
also saw among Modi supporters were talking about their rights here as Indian
Yeah.
Americans. So, but
Yeah.
Hindu nationalists when it comes to India. So,
So that's lovely. So that's great. We already have
interesting
your
times.
next presentation, hopefully in person in New York. But thanks again, everyone, for attending. Emily, as always, thanks for organizing and keeping us all together. And Sharon, best of luck with the book tour, and hope we get to see you in New York soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Hope to see you in the